And know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. I'm Russ Rapp, and this is my YouTube channel about non-duality. And in this live talk, we're going to be talking obviously about non-duality, but also about habits and what that means in regards to this topic. And ultimately, habits aren't really have don't really have anything to do with non-duality, but as a seeker on this topic, that's one of the things that maybe will shed some light on your inner workings and maybe give you some guidance as to your own life and what you're really doing here watching this live talk about non-duality. So welcome. If you're joining us in this video live, you can put some messages in the chat, and I'd like to interact with you with your comments and questions as we go along here. And if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I like to do these live talks somewhat on a weekly basis, just depending. But the best way to know when I'm going to go live, I didn't give much of a notice today, maybe a half hour. But if you subscribe to my channel, then obviously you'll be able to get a notification that I'm going live so you can join us. I've produced many other videos on this specific niche topic, and you can go back through and watch those on my channel. And the great thing about non-duality is it gives you nothing, you learn nothing. And so we talk about things that are, you know, in the stratosphere of non-duality that never quite really pinpoint what non-duality is trying to say. So instead of speaking in parables, I guess I should start out, if you're new to the topic, this concept, as we talk about it as human beings, we use communication language to talk about a concept that isn't something that is logical or something that we can really ultimately observe or define. So that's where the conundrum, the paradox comes into play. Obviously, looking at the word non-duality, non means not, and dual means two, so not two. Most likely, that simple definition bears no meaning to your life, and so therefore, you'll find no value out of this conversation. But if you're somewhat familiar with the topic, you'll see a little bit as you reflect on your motivations for approaching this topic, for trying to understand what non-duality is teaching. There can be some glimpses of wisdom that you can gain from this understanding or lack thereof. Because I think one of the best analogies I like about relating to non-duality is this idea of it's a mirror. And so everything that we see with our five senses, everything that we think, our thought processes, how our mind creates meaning in our life, all of that goes to something that we can objectify, that we can look at and say, hey, this, not that, or whatever, netty, I think people sometimes say, not this, not that. And so if we look at the things that we can observe, then we can separate ourselves from that observation instead of being attached to them. So it's in some sense that process is a way to unravel the onion, to find the center that of the onion, and find some growth opportunities from this process that isn't a process. And that's where some of the confusion lies, as we try to use this as something to personally develop or to gain wisdom. And yet the truth of non-duality is accepting of what is, and the truth of that is beyond our understanding, beyond our capabilities, and therefore there's nothing you can do to change the reality of non-duality. You can only perceive dualistically as self, other, object, subject, That's how we, as human beings or entities in this world, perceive reality as that's that, and this is me. That's not me. This is me. We see that duality, and that's how we understand and create meaning. That's how we understand the world around us. And it's kind of the idea of space time. In order to have an object, there has to be a relation to something else in space. And in the movement of those objects, we perceive time. And within that, that's how we uh, define ourselves in this universe, if you will. And the the nature of that creation of meaning is through habits, is through habitual behavior. um, so as humans, we use our abstract thinking to create an understanding that is maybe sets us apart from other entities or conscious beings or unconscious beings in our universe, and we use that to in many different ways from a development standpoint. And we do that on a consistent basis, and so as a individual, as an ego, a separate self, we create our reality in a sense, moment to moment. um, if you look from a scientific standpoint, what our bodies are consisted of, essentially energy or empty space, however you want to look at it. um, but there is a consistency, there is a repetition to that reality. And so I'm not just a blob, there's a specific sort of uh, habitual creation that happens moment to moment, and we attach our identity to that. And that requires that we see ourselves in time. And so the moment we try to uh, nail down or pinpoint or carve out our identity, this is who I am, this is my reality, through time that shifts into another form, essentially. And so the ultimate reality of who you define yourself to be changes from moment to moment. Therefore, the solidity of that identification is essentially unreal. And another non-dual speaker, Paul Hedderman, who I like to listen to on occasion, talks about this in the terms of verbing. And so, our ego, instead of seeing our ego or a separate self or however else we want to define it, as an object, as a something, it's a verbing, it's an action that happens on a habitual, continual basis. Hey, welcome. We've got non-duality as a scam joining us. Non-duality as a scam says, "Good morning, sir. Good morning to you." So we do that habitually as an action, essentially, and part of that is a way to look at ourselves not as an object, but as a continuously moving um, form, a constantly shifting form that we um, so it's a way to kind of describe it as a way so we don't get attached to it. So it's in a sense, a lot of the people that talk about non-duality, the purpose and the way that it's communicated is a way to try not to have your um, personal identification attached to the message itself, because that's what we do on a consistent basis. We're constantly attached, much like my mind is attached to my body and I'm attached to this ego personality. And so when you see other non-dual speakers, they talk about things and there is no person. um, you talk about verbing instead of a self object type of a framework. A lot of times speaking of yourself in third person can be a way to highlight that fact, or to say that there is no one here, or you will never understand this message, there's nothing that you can get from this. It's all in an attempt to not allow your mind to grab onto it and say, I understand it. I have something. I learned something. This is something I now have achieved, and now I am somehow a non-dual guru master, and I can go forth and have a perfect, peaceful life. Daryl Sanders, hello, Russ, and all. Good morning, Daryl, or whatever time frame you're in. And we had daylight savings time here today, so that went. Actually, that was fine. I didn't mind it. I get up early anyway, so it didn't really make a difference to me. And I'm glad they do that on a Sunday morning versus a weekday. So the impetus, the origin of this topic for me, and I spoke of this in my last live talk, and part of that was just me, a free flow of ideas, of things I was trying to say, and I think it was fairly long-winded and maybe didn't get to the point as quickly as would be helpful or beneficial for you. Um, so I was kind of thinking out loud, if you will. And after that talk, a good part of that process is once you start saying things, once you start creating and producing, now you have something that's tangible that you can look at and you can reflect on and say, hey, how did that come across? What was that? How was that communicated? And there's um, something that you can really uh, look at and take into account. And it's kind of like the same way when I know when if you're familiar with Byron Katie and her 4 questions about, is it true? Can you be absolutely true or absolutely sure that it's true? And the third one is, um, how do I react when I think this thought? And then the fourth one is something to the effect of, who would I be without this thought? So those are kind of the 4 questions through her process that she teaches, and I maybe butchered that a little bit, but you get the idea. So Byron Katie, and I think her website's The Work. So doing the work, and part of that, I think, in that process, which I worked with a little bit on my own, is instead of having that thought in your head and saying, um, I am feeling anxious, or my dog hates me, or um, the weather has it out for me. Whatever the thought is that you're trying to examine, instead of just having that in your head and making that being transmutable or having it shift in the way the mind works, you actually have to write it down, because then it gives it something tangible that you can really reflect on and use, because your mind is amazing at um, doing backflips and creating little magician's tricks to get you back into uh, what it wants you to do. And this goes a long way with habit creation and that sort of thing, and this whole process of trying to grab onto non-duality as a concept, is it constantly shifts, and in the moment that you think you have something, then um, or the moment that you apparently let go of the things that you're holding on to, the identification with the separate self or the ego, the the mind body emotions kicks in and find something else to grab onto. And if it doesn't grab onto that, well, maybe it'll grab onto this, maybe it'll grab onto that. And it's kind of like it's kind of out seeking, out searching for something to grasp onto that you can claim and attach to keep the same process, the same mental faculties and identification going. So it doesn't want to be forgotten about and left alone and disregarded. And so it wants to be loved. So the quote that I heard about a week or so ago that kind of started me down this process or path of talking about habits and that sort of thing was a quote from Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller is quoted as saying, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And at the time when I heard that initially, it really struck a chord with me and really I connected with it. And that's kind of how the process of um, understanding works, or trying to seek for wisdom, is we all look for this grand awakening, this final event where it's like, now I am dubbed awakened, and everything is how it should be, and I am completely fulfilled in pure awareness, and all this other stuff, however you want to define your final achievement of the goal. But it's ultimately not what the great awakening is about. And so, oftentimes we learn through little jumps and little things that we grab onto and say, "Hey, that's something that makes sense. I connect with. I did something internally within me. It freed me of something, or I gained some sort of wisdom nugget." And then you let it go and on to the next thing. So I'm going to read it one more time. "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So that's Buckminster Fuller. And I went on the reputable source Wikipedia and read a little bit about Mr. Buckminster Fuller. And he was born in 1895 and died in 1983. He was an American architect, systems theorist, author, designer, inventor, critic of work, and futurist. So kind of a big thinker. And in reading his life story profile, kind of got me thinking along the lines of, from a Myers-Briggs standpoint. um, I guess I resonate with the personality type on the Myers-Briggs of the INTP, which is introverted, intuition, thinking, and perceiving, which a famous thinker of the time, of his time, would be Albert Einstein, kind of along those lines. Which, I don't say that as an ego boost, but just so you can relate to what that personality type is. And I've seen other. I mean, anyone can have an opinion on what personality type a person has, but I've seen for Nikola Tesla, his personality type oftentimes is considered a INTJ, and so the P and the J are flipped between Einstein and Tesla. And from my research about it, is it's kind of the idea of um, Einstein used used the mind as a way to see the world in the way that it's see the perfection, to understand the truth of reality, to use those ideas to get rid of the inconsistencies or the errors, and to see what is truly represented out there in the world, in his own way, in like physics and in the natural world, science, and that sort of thing. Whereas Tesla wasn't as concerned about coming up with some grand theory about the universe, but it was more of, how can I apply this knowledge? How can I do something useful out of it? How can I create something with the knowledge? Not just the knowledge in and of itself, but more so the benefit or the application of the knowledge. So he was I'd say more of an inventor versus, Einstein, E equals MC squared theory type work. Tesla was building things, creating things, and uh, very interesting, his life story. And so I relate kind of Tesla mindset to what I've read a little bit in the 15-minute Wikipedia scan that I did about Buckminster Fuller. I kind of relate him more to the INTJ, Tesla type of mindset. But in his profile, it says Fuller said that he had experienced a profound incident which would provide direction and purpose for his life. He felt as though he was suspended several feet above the ground, enclosed in a white sphere of light. A voice spoke directly to Fuller and declared, so this is kind of during a period of depression and struggle that he was going through. I think he said his daughter died about 5 years before. But this voice spoke directly to Fuller and declared, "From now on, you need never await temporal attestation to your thought. You think the truth. You do not have the right to eliminate yourself," because he was considering suicide. "You do not belong to you. You belong to the universe. Your significance will remain forever obscure to you, but you may assume that you are fulfilling your role if you apply yourself to converting your experiences to the highest advantage of others." And so instead of his blinders being on and focus on how much his life sucks, this voice spoke to him and said, "Hey, look around. You're here for a reason, and you may never understand that reason, but get over yourself." That they probably spoke more eloquently. Whatever that voice was, it was something that affected him in his life and kind of changed his path that he was on. Um, the interesting thing is the first line is, "You never need to wait temporal attestation to your thought." I think with non-duality is um, thinking about it in terms of the passage of time, of how time operates when it comes to, we talk about free will versus destiny, and uh, the choice versus something that's fated. And when we think, well, I have the power to lift my hand up and down, I've talked about that before. um, it's easy to see, oh, I have this power, this control over my life. But when you expand that out over years or decades, um, you may have this grand scheme or plan, and it's all those we can all relate to plans that we had that ultimately fell through or never quite manifested. There's a lot of focus in these types of circles of spirituality of, how do we manifestation? How do you create your life? And it's easy to think, okay, I'm going to take a sip of this tea. Look how powerful I am. But then if you take that same mindset of your own personal control over your life, and you see all the variables or everything within the world that you live in that we have no control over, it becomes a scary place. We realize how small and insignificant we really are when we see ourselves as a individual, persisting, separate self. And so when you think of it over a span of time, it can be helpful to look at it in that way, to know that, maybe the control I think I have, I don't necessarily have. And how do I deal with that? And so that was a little bit about Buckminster Fuller. Um, but back to his quote, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. I think when it comes to people that are getting into non-duality and kind of learn the basic concept, then there's this because a part of it is negating the identification with who you believe yourself to be, or the separate self, the ego, the personality, those structures, that habit, that verbing that we do. And that sense of control is something that we want to hold on to, that separate self wants to hold on to. And so there's this uh, apparent pushback from that which you used to identify with that which you are trying to objectify or disidentify with. And what can happen is there's this constant battle to be free from it, um, as it. so so you want to free yourself from the separate self as the separate self. But the battle goes on because it's the same thing, creating its own um, reality by saying that it's trying to get rid of itself. So it's creating more of what it's trying to get rid of. Non-duality is a scam says, if there is effort, there will be conflict. Yeah, it's if there is effort, there will be conflict. It's kind of like, what doesn't kill you make you stronger, or Um, what's that one other T-shirt people wear? Something about uh, pain is weakness leaving the body. Um, Non-duality is a scam says a conflict between what happened and what we tried to make happen. Yeah, so it's this idea of goal setting or trying to manifest your life, that sort of thing. And so there's this with non-duality, it's just more of the same process of how the let's say ego tries to operate, where you're trying to now, and it's no longer something where I'm just want to manifest eating a sandwich that I think is delicious. It's more of I'm manifesting a complete and total negation of who I identified with before. And so the bar gets raised to a level where it's you ultimately fail on a continual basis, because I need to be more pure awareness. I need to be more aware, more conscious. And the more I separate from life, or abstractly view life or conceptualize, or the more I have emotions that are negative, or more that I have desires or attachments, then it just proves how I failed at becoming a non-dual entity or a non-dual master. And then the thing that you're trying to achieve, which is to relieve yourself of all of these burdens, all this baggage that you're slugging around on a daily basis, becomes even larger to some extent. So then, it's the darkness before the dawn, where you know you only, like Sarah says in the second Matrix, is you only truly know someone when you fight them. It's kind of like, um, what he's saying is you get to know the person through that struggle, through that conflict. But the process of letting go, the knowledge of the self, the know thyself, the process of that is actually learning what you're not, because you're seeing what you are, and the observer of that recognizes that what is being observed is temporal, or um, in a sense illusory. And so, we're about half hour into this conversation. um, Non-duality scam says, yes, love that quote, a warrior must fully understand his foe. Yes. Uh, the art of war, Sun Tzu, I think, is that's who wrote it, right? Let me check here. That's another good quote. um, so just bear with me, because time's an illusion. So art of that's a great thing about technology these days, is you have a thought, it's so easy to find information. I said Sun Tzu, didn't I? Yeah. Let's find a good quote from that. Oops. Let's see. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. I like this one. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Let your plans be dark and impenetrable as night, and when you move, fall like a thunderbolt. Supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. And all warfare is based on deception. Hence, when we are able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When we are far away, we must make him believe we are near. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. So if you haven't read the Art of War, I would definitely recommend going through that. I read it in the morning here, I don't know, a while back, a year or two ago. I don't know if it took me a couple hours, but you can find it online. Um, the whole thing is just amazing, but it talks in a lot of dualistically terms, where if appear strong when you're weak, or weak when you appear when you're strong. But it's a way to kind of um, you know it's the art of war. Non-Duality is a Scam says, also recommends 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. So I'm not familiar with that, but maybe I'll check that out. So we're constantly at war essentially, because when you create yourself versus the world versus the objects that you perceive, then there's a constant struggle, a constant conflict. And part of that is just a natural process of development, of manifestation, of reality in a sense. And there's always the constant um, disregard or um, ignoring the unmanifest or the potential or um, what is seen to be non-existent, the nothingness to the everythingness, the emptiness of reality, because none of that is useful when it comes to navigating the world we perceive. So like I said, we're a half hour in about, and I just want to cover the quick uh, nuts and bolts of what I wanted to say in the last live talk that I did regarding habits. And I think that what I want to start with specifically on this is that quote from Buckminster Fuller about you never change things by fighting the existing reality, you just make the existing model obsolete. So habits that you have, that you create, whether there is an intention behind it or not. So you can create a habit just by doing, so there's no conscious awareness of what you're trying to accomplish in that habit. So whether it's deemed or judged as a positive or negative habit, it's just something that the mind does. So it's something that how we operate and learn in the world. It's kind of like how um, the instinct of animals, how they've learned how to survive in nature through repetition, through creating structures that creates safety and security. Because ultimately, that's part of the main striving of us as human beings is the struggle to survive. And so the mind works in a lot of ways from, I don't know if you would consider it, from the brain stem, the reptilian brain kind of functioning in that sense, but that's a part of who we are in many ways, and it can drive our motivations and desires in life, whether we're aware of it or not. So creating habits is something that we naturally do, maybe some more than others. And whether we have the intention behind the habit or not is to some extent irrelevant. And we can, but as a creative being, if we have intention, we have more um, ways to manifest in things that we want to see and perceive and experience in our lives. So there's that process. But if you do something in a repetitive way, whether or not you're aware of it, it creates that habit within your life. And so oftentimes when it comes to habits, people become more focused or aware of them when they seem to be functioning incorrectly or in a way that is deemed to be negative. And then there's an intention behind that. So there's an awareness of those habits that have already been created. We become culturalized. Is that even a word? Culturalized, domesticated. As we develop, grow up from birth, and go through the whole process of becoming an adult. Um, we grow up in an environment, and we're shaped by that environment in many ways. And so we develop those habits through our family life, through our society, through our experiences, and that shapes part of who we see ourselves to be and the habits that we have. So when you look at your life and you reflect on your current habits, oftentimes it's how do I get rid of the habits that I have? And so, addictions are habits. Like Paul Hedderman talks a lot about addictions because that's something that he's dealt with in the past. And those are all, in a sense, habits. Um, for me, it's just the addiction to the mind, to thinking, to that process, being a type 5 on the Enneagram. That's kind of a standard fare. So that's where I relate more to kind of these conceptual topics of non duality because that's been my experience. Other people maybe haven't seen that in their own lives. Maybe their focus, their habits are in other places that they see as being a struggle or a problem. Non duality is a scam says repetition breeds unconsciousness. Well, yeah, so that's and I know there's people that talk about this in more depth and probably more eloquently. I know there's books out there about how we create habits and repetition, and it's kind of like I think I talked in the last video about riding a bike. There's an intention of riding a bike. There's a process of learning, of muscle training, of muscle movement, and through that repetition, then that's how we learn. And then the conscious becomes the unconscious or the subconscious, and no longer is something that we need to do to operate. And a lot of times it's a focus on how the mind works, but your physical body works in a lot of the same ways. It's a like your heart beats whether or not you think about it beating. It's created that repetition. It's what's keeping you alive in many ways. Without your heartbeat, you'd be dead unless, you can have some sort of, you know, machine pump your blood. But there's no thought process or no really intention of training of beating your heart. It just happens without your conscious awareness. And if you bring consciousness to it, there's ways to slow your blood pressure or lower your blood pressure, your breathing, that sort of thing. There's techniques you can do to shift and change, but ultimately, it's going to beat whether you wanted it to or not. It's going to stop beating whether you want it to or not. Um, there's not much control you have over that. So when it becomes learning a personal habit, it's a matter of being aware of it or unaware of it. But through that process of doing things over and over again, there's a learning that's involved. Um, and so it becomes something that you're not aware of. So when you become aware of those unconscious habits or those things that you've developed, then there's a focus on trying to, you know, either increase positive habits, learn new habits, or get rid of old negative habits that aren't benefiting your life. And this has nothing really to do with non-duality, but it's something that I think a lot of people focus on when it comes to this topic, and maybe there's some benefit you can glean from this. But whether you have habits or not, or you have control over your your moment to moment behavior and attitudes, is irrelevant to what non-duality is really trying to say. And so, when it comes to getting rid of negative habits, I think the one thing I wanted to really hone in on in this conversation um, is seeing your how your mind operates, how you are as a human being, and loving that existence, loving that um, process that seems to appear, versus trying to fight against it. And it's kind of like, you need to eat on a daily basis. You can go, 7 days without food, but ultimately your body needs nourishment. I know there's spiritual masters that claim to not eat and they just get nourishment from the air, but most of us don't have that experience. So I'm not going to really talk about that. But you need to have consume calories. You need to have nutrition in order to survive as a human being, much like breathing or drinking water. And if we negate that and say, well, I'm a no person, there is no person, and we don't eat and we don't drink, then we die. I don't think that's helpful for your ego either. And it's just a way that life operates. And so habits are much in the same way. We create habits, whether intentionally or not, but that process of how the mind works, of how it obsesses on things, how it focuses on things, how it creates meaning, how it constantly tries to attach to identification with the ego, with itself, essentially. Um, it tries to define the world as I or me and everything else. That's just what it does. And so to pretend that that's not something that happens is maybe not very uh, a very fruitful endeavor. And so when you look at negative habits that you have, and so one way to break habits is to do something different on a consistent basis. So if it's a habit that you have on a continual basis, it's much easier to break the habit in a sense. And I do want to clarify, I'm not a psychologist, therapist. I don't have a degree. I don't have any um, medical pedigree. So if you have struggles, if you have issues, go see a professional. I'm not a professional. I'm just giving my experience. So when it comes to negative habits, if you can do something differently um, on a consistent basis, you can alter or change a habit. And it comes down to having faith versus fear, because oftentimes if there's a negative habit, there's a reaction to doing something different. Um, there's maybe feelings that come up, or bodily responses to shifting the security and safety of the habit that's been created. And so you have to ultimately sit with that and be able to just do something different. And that's where the thought process kind of fails, because the thought process is feeding off of that energy of the body and trying to maintain that negative pattern or habit that you have. And with that, it's going to try to tell you to maintain it and give you all this reasons why not to. And so the solution ultimately isn't necessarily, there can be an intention of the mind, but you have to make the jump, you have to make the leap. And you may fail the first time, or the first 100 times, first 1,000 times, but it's more of the instinct is the thing of just doing, and the doing um, is the process that can undo the habit, because the habit is something that's instinctual at that point anyway. So your mind can disagree, but ultimately you have to make the choice, have the faith to make the leap to change the habit. So to have faith over fear. And with that, it's just the recognition of having that love for who you are, that failed sinful separate self, that you want to have a habit, you want to have that safety and security. And so to disregard that, to deny that, can cause more pain and suffering. And so to really own that and to recognize that, and maybe it's just a matter of having a different uh, outlook towards the dismantlement of the habit. Instead of saying I'm doing this because I want to get rid of the habit, it's more honoring the inclination to create habits and saying I'm going to create a new habit. So it's becoming more of a creative type of a focus of having more of a um, willful energy towards the creation of habits. So instead of saying you shouldn't have habits, or the mind having habits, it's a bad thing. Um, it's recognizing that's what the mind does, and deciding to be a creative uh, human being, and putting forth a new habit, essentially, even though the new habit may be not even a habit at all. And so if you're obsessing or have OCD or those types of tendencies, it's not necessarily getting rid of the habit and saying, well, having a habit sucks, or doing this over repetitively is bad. But it maybe the new habit is to do it mindfully once and move on. So even though it's not really a habit, because that's how we operate as human beings, it's seeing it in a way where you're still honoring the need, the fear, in a sense. You're loving that inner child, but at the same time, you're acting as an adult, and you're taking the step to do it in a powerful, creative way. So that's my my talk on habits. And if you gain something from that, that's great. uh, what that changes with non-duality is nothing. That's the beauty of non-duality, is everything that you trying to seek for is trying to give you something, you're trying to attain something, but non-duality does none of those things. So whether or not you fail at creating new habits or getting rid of negative habits, it makes no difference to this, essentially. Non-duality is a scam, says some habits are, of course, necessary. Laugh aloud, breathing, brushing your teeth. Psychological habits are always destructive. Um, Non-duality is a scam also says, but what if I put effort into acting spontaneously? That's kind of what I was saying. Is the focus on acting spontaneously can be a habit because it's something that is not being currently done when you're not acting spontaneously. Then I'm making a habit out of it. Uh, in Non-Duality is a Scam also says, I must simply understand the nature of habit on a deep level, and then it'll be my habit to have no habit. Appreciate it, Russ. Thank you for speaking the truth. Well, you're welcome. I mean, we can't point to, we can only point in the direction of what non-duality is trying to get across. Um, but I think what can be more effective for people as far as um, the the motivation for this topic is habits is a big part of that, because the habit attachment to the separate self is so pervasive because it's unseen, it's in the background, it's the wizard behind the curtain. It's something that we don't even think exists, and so therefore we put no effort into understanding it, and so it just operates as a program, and we focus on the results, the consequences of the attachment to the separate self, and um, we don't focus on that, on the separate self or the ego itself. And once you do that, there's a strong pushback because it doesn't want to be seen. It wants to just exist in the background. And so that's why I think focusing on habits can be beneficial, because we're pointing to that which does not exist, that which is an illusion, essentially, um, versus trying to seek something that we can't find. Non-duality scam says psychological habit happens automatically and we are unaware of it. And you also said psychological habits are always destructive. Uh, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that, I guess, but a few more minutes here. I want to read maybe a couple comments that I received on some videos. Oh, well, there was one long comment that I thought was really helpful, but I think it would be a long conversation. But it's on my Lies About Non-Duality video, um, from D. Bondas. And you can probably read my response to it. I won't get into that. But the question is, D. Bondas says, hello, this is a great video and it did clear a couple things for me. However, I've been doing a lot of research and reading opinions about non-duality, and a couple things still stump me. First off, what made it so that my perception is in my particular body? Why mine and not, say, Trump or you or my cousin's uncle or even a dog? Why am I looking out of my two eyes? Is this where evolution comes into play, or does non duality have an explanation to this? Obviously, consciousness is everywhere and everything. However, consciousness without conscious awareness isn't actually aware to my understanding. How I interpret the state of pure consciousness is the state that you are in a deep, dreamless sleep. Therefore, conscious couldn't have a way of choosing how to distribute itself into. If you could offer any insight into this and that would be into this, that would be dope. Dope. Cheers. Yeah, I love comments like that because it's, there's really a kind of a deep uh, way of trying to understand non-duality, and I appreciate that. So you can read my response if you want on that video for that comment. I think we I think the key of that whole that comment, or just comments in general, questions is, um, when it comes to non-duality, I don't have the answers. You don't have the answer. But by looking at the questions themselves and inquiring as to why you want to know, that can kind of point you in the direction of where the habit, where the attachment lies, and so you can look at that and see that for what it is. Non-duality is a scam says it's like you said, it happens by itself for itself while concealing itself. Yep. Well, this has been a real interesting. I appreciate all the comments here. So that was very enjoyable. I feel like even though I didn't get to the main topic of habits right away in the first part of the video, I feel like I hope I was a little bit more succinct than I was previously. And if you have watched this entire video from the start to finish, I applaud you, and you should definitely subscribe to my channel because I think you would enjoy the rest of the videos. Non-duality scam says, nah, bro. All we can do is just be authentic. Nobody has all the answers. Yeah, and that's I'm aware of the fact that that's kind of my my place, or my there's an intention behind how I approach this topic of non-duality, partly from my own inclinations and partly from trying to differentiate myself from other speakers and that sort of thing, because it's if you really look at the logical explanation, the concept itself of non-duality, then it's available and open to everyone at all times. And so there is no master guru that has finally achieved some status, some level of aware of pure awareness or whatever. And so to have the trappings of that, to have the references, to have all of the, you know I'm sitting on my floor with some blinds behind me. I mean, there's an intention that I don't care, um, but I do care, and so that's also not true. And there is a motivation for this, whether I'm aware exactly of what that is or not. And at the end of the day, that doesn't matter because this is what appears to happen. Um, so there is I did intentionally, especially from my first video, best method to achieve non-duality, or to experience non-duality. I've had the most views on that one, and I put probably the most effort into across the board of producing that video, in a way, because a lot of non-dual speakers have this free form talk like this, where it's just kind of spewed forth, and there's really no um, packaging to it, where you can the separate self can use it as something, and that's what we all are seeking. And so part of my intention to separate myself from others is to package it in a form that's digestible, that people can feel like they get something out of, and be able to grow the channel through that. And yet at the end of the day, I just don't have the motivation to do that at this point in time. Maybe that's something I'll do down the road, but I have videos that are packaged up a little bit tighter that you can watch. But at the end of the day, I enjoy this because there is the back and forth. There is a little bit more of a dialogue to some extent. And allows me to kind of free form my ideas, practice, speaking publicly on a camera. And so it's skills being gained through this process, and I just enjoyed the topic because it's such a free topic, because you know it is what it is, and I can't really be wrong, or I can be right, but it doesn't really matter. And it's fun to uncover what it brings to the table once you start talking about nothing, essentially. Non-duality scam says nobody has all the oh, I already read that. Nobody has all the answers. My only intention in life is for mankind to be completely free. I guess what I would say to that, non-duality is a scam is to your intention in life for mankind to be completely free. Um, what if mankind is already free? And there's a recognition of the freedom that pervades um, that exists within all of us. Seeing, I guess you could say it in a way, it's seeing the divinity in everyone, whether we're sitting in a jail cell or having a mental breakdown or whatever. There's this stillness, this peace uh, underlying all of that, and to see people for their essence, if you will, even though sometimes people misinterpret that word, but seeing that within all people and recognizing the freedom that we already have and seeing that's the inherent nature of our reality. It's kind of like the US Constitution, the inalienable rights given by God. There's kind of that um, foundation of reality that we blossom from. So thank you for joining. Oh, I got one more comment, and then I'm going to wrap it up here. For the not so spiritual, how do you see the divinity in others when all you experience is the outline and the colors of their body? Yeah, I'm speaking abstractly or conceptually. If you want to say recognize, and this is non-duality is a scam. If you want to say recognizing freedom they have, I'm okay with that. I understand it's the same. I'm glad you approve. Yeah, so it's not something as far as, seeing, perceiving the outlines, colors of their body or their physical 3D appearance. It's not so much that. It's a way that to describe the inner knowing, if you will, of knowing that we're all here, where we go one, we go all. All right, so thank you for your participation and like I said, we'll see you next time. Subscribe and we will go from there.